What's the aftermath of the presidential election going to look like? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle during election week. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners in this momentous week of politics as usual.
Yep, we've finally arrived, Richard, the presidential election. So I thought we'd devote this time to it, and really what the likely aftermath is. We don't know whether it's going to be Trump or Harris, but the way I look at this, Richard, it really doesn't make a whole great big hill of beans difference. That at least not so far as freedom is concerned, because as one op-ed writer put it, uh, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. You've got a right-wing status versus a left-wing status. And I suppose you could look at variations in their different positions and say, well, one is better here and one is better there. But as we've been pointing out for 34 years here at FFF, if we're going to achieve a free society, we cannot be looking to get people in to office who are going to better manage the welfare warfare state. We need to dismantle the infringements on freedom. And these two people, Trump and Biden, are committed to elongating the system. Now, they may emphasize different aspects of it. One may be better in one area versus another area. But the fact is, they both believe fervently in the welfare state way of life and the warfare state way of life. The drug war, they're both advocates of the drug war. They're both advocates of the immigration controls and a massive immigration police state along the border. They both believe in foreign interventionism. They may disagree on should we intervene here or intervene there, but they both believe in this system. And so the honeymoon is over. For the last couple of years, they've been both Democrats and Republicans and the candidates especially been very nice to the American people. Oh, I'm going to promise you this. I'm going to promise you that. Just vote for me, and man, paradise will be here. But everybody knows it's a sham. Everybody enjoys the process because you've got the ruler, whoever the ruler is going to be, being very nice to people. It has to be nice to get the vote. And so this goes on for a couple of years where, wow, they're nice to us. But the day after the election, the hangover sets in. And that's when people realize, oh, no, we're back to reality. They don't have to be nice to us anymore. And they won't be nice, whether it's Harris or Trump. They're now the power. It's back to serf and master in a very, very exposed way, where the master doesn't have to be nice, at least not for another 2 years. And everybody knows that they are now relegated to their role as serfs in this society. Yeah. Hayek, wrote that famous book, The Road to Serfdom. Well, the end of that road was reached a long time ago. We live as serfs in the welfare warfare state way of life. Our job is to serve the greater good. Our efforts, our work efforts in the economy are designed to sustain the welfare warfare state. They need us in order to produce wealth that they can tax to support this ever-growing, massive system. And it's getting worse and worse because the serfs are not putting out as much as they want them to. That's why you have this deficit of $2 trillion a year. They can't tax enough. And so they resort to the printing press, to debasement of the currency, to debt, $35 trillion in debt. That'll be $37 trillion in debt. And so you've got this massive system that has failed. The war on poverty, the war on wealth, the war on drugs, the war on immigrants, the war on this and the war on that, foreign interventionism. The whole thing's a failure. They look for scapegoats. Throughout history, people with failed systems look for scapegoats. The most popular one is illegal immigrants, but there's also Russia, China, Iran. There's always, oh, they're coming to get us, and all of our problems, are due to them. And so, what do we libertarians do in this context? Do we embroil ourselves in the system, trying to, you know, get involved in the Harris administration and try to make the system work, or get embroiled in the Trump administration and try to get the system work? No, we keep doing what we're doing. We keep setting forth that vision for what a genuine free society is, with the idea that in order to achieve freedom, you've got to dismantle infringements on freedom. You can't reform them. You can't fix them. You can't make them better. All you're doing is making your serfdom more palatable. That in order to achieve that freedom, you've got to dismantle infringements on freedom, which means identifying what the infringements are in freedom are, and then making the case. And for dismantling, not for reform. With the idea is that we are looking for that critical mass of people that will bring a giant paradigm shift, not toward minor reforms, but toward the free society. What do you think, Richard?
Well, on your last point, before I'd like to add a few other things about do you try to attempt to work from the inside or the outside? Uh, Two prominent free market advocates of the second half of the 20th century have been Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell. Both of them, I understand, were at various times offered positions within the government, obviously by Republican administrations, not surprisingly. And both Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell chose to turn them down. Primarily, and I'm summarizing their respective arguments that they have made several times in explaining their decisions to decline these government positions, was that once they participated in the government structures, they would be compromised. They would be confined to one degree or another to having to defend the overall administration's policies, and that therefore they could not be a critic of the administration in which they served, when they would often feel that what the administration was doing, in which they would be an appointee, was failing to move in the proper free market directions. To have that intellectual honesty, that intellectual independence, to have these both popular and scholarly ability to speak the truth without compromise because of one's position, they chose to operate outside. And I would argue that people like Milton Friedman or Thomas Sowell have been far more effective in trying to influence people's opinions over the last half century or more, let's say. Milton Friedman passed away a good number of years ago, but Thomas Sowell is still alive writing at, 95 or 96. And that therefore that is the way to try to influence opinion, not to allow oneself to be compromised by being sucked into the establishment of either party, because immediately that ties you to having to both justify and defend and personally censor yourself because you can't speak the truth. So it's important to be an independent voice, not to feel an undeserved and unneeded and compromising allegiance. But to go back to some of your other points, if I may, the reason why it really is not that much of a difference in the overall wider scheme of things as to whether Trump or Harris win. And admittedly, as you were saying, Jacob, Trump might do some policies that would be less destructive to liberty. Can't imagine what Harris would do that would be undestructive of liberty, but I'm sure there's hypothetically some civil liberty issue, maybe. But regardless of which one and the emphases and the direction and the focus of the policies, the underlying principles of both candidates, of both party platforms. And in my latest article for the Foundation's publication, Future Freedom, and which is now up on the FFF website, this election is about big government getting bigger. And part of what I meant by that is that both candidates and both parties, as represented by their advocates and certainly by their party platforms, accept a common premise. And that premise is that individuals have neither the knowledge, wisdom, or ability to guide and direct and plan their own lives. That social interactions, when left unrestrained, other than within the rules of law of you don't kill, you don't steal, and you don't lie and deceive, uh, are unreliable in generating the results that others, ideological and intellectual elites, believe should be the outcomes of society. Therefore, it is necessary for government to direct, plan, constrain, subsidize, restrict, or prohibit certain forms of social and even personal and certainly economic activities, with those in charge, from the president in the Oval Office down within these administrations and in the Congress, determining what are the corridors in which we will be directed according to their taxing, spending, subsidizing, prohibiting, protecting policies. This was expressed perhaps clearest once by Donald Trump when he was in the presidency. He had a news conference, and one of the CNN reporters asked him a question, which obviously upset Trump. And Trump said, "Why don't you just run CNN and let me run the country?" Notice the mindset. Let me run the country. That is, I have the knowledge, wisdom, ability, and the need to guide and direct the lives of over 330 million people. What gives him both the authority to do so? He's an individual just like us. And what proves that he has the capacity to do so? This is part of that Austrian economic argument, particularly Hayek's, that knowledge is dispersed in society. Each of us at the most knows a small fraction of all the knowledge, wisdom, experiences, and possibilities in the world, which are diffused, decentralized, dispersed among all the individual minds of the society. Separate even from the argument, each individual should have the essential and inherent and unimpinged right to peacefully guide and direct and plan his own life. Even beyond that most fundamental principle, the arrogance, the hubris of a Donald Trump or a Kamala Harris or any of these others to believe that they have the capacity, they and their advisors and staffers and bureaucratic structures have the capacity to know enough to redesign society, to direct society, to plan society. That is the ultimate arrogance and the hubris in this. And both candidates are offering their own variations of this. It would be like the 1930s, where there's totalitarian Soviet Russia under Stalin and totalitarian Nazi Germany under Hitler. And now having to choose between them. Now, are they the same totalitarianism? No, they justify their ideologies different. Class struggle, race struggle. They want to do certain types of central planning as opposed to other types of planning. Stalin had his 5-year plans. Hitler had his 4-year plans. The Soviets nationalized everything. The Nazis did not. So most property was left in private hands, but the government dictated, directed, commanded, determined how businessmen use their property, prices, wages, production, distributions, so that private businessmen basically became nothing more than a government employee who was told what to do with his own property. So yes, there were differences between them and focuses and rationales and justifications and goals even, but the inherent structure was the right of the state to control, manage, and direct everything in people's lives. Now, it is not as in your face in the United States. And we have, democratic elections in which the candidates must present themselves to the public, the voters, the constituencies. Please, I want to give back. I want to serve you. I am here to see that your life is made better. And here's my grab bag of things that I want to do for you. And there's the other person's grab bag of things that they want to do for you. And to have this grab bag as opposed to that grab bag, you just have to be induced to give campaign contributions and votes on election day to this person as opposed to that person. And your life will be made better, more just, wealthier, more prosperous, fairer, happier, harmonious by keeping these evils and divisiveness out. And notice, it's not as if Donald Trump doesn't want harmony. He just defines how you get harmony different from Kamala Harris. And both see conflicts, the enemies, this, that, and the other. So all it is are variations on the same collectivist, political paternalistic mindset. And all you're choosing upon is which one you will, in a sense, as Ayn Rand once expressed it, sanction of the victim, give your endorsement to, as to who will then be in charge of guiding and directing and planning your life according to the platform and the policies that they promised. And now, when they're in office, they're going to give them to you by straitjacketing your life. You give them the freedom to basically control you. And that's the only choice we have in this election, as we've had virtually in every other election. There have been elections where there are people who have advocated freedom. I'm, of course, going back to Thomas Jefferson, but we did have a few in the past. But that's basically the choice this year. Now, obviously, an individual might think that holding your nose, as one reporter said in the Wall Street Journal in an op-ed today, you choose that one or that one. I don't really care about that. People vote, they make their choices. But the underlying principle here is that both are merely two variations on the same collectivist paternalistic planning theme. And that is the mindset, the political framework that friends of freedom, advocates of liberty, must eventually help to overcome. So that is not the choices we're faced. That a day may come when we can have a situation where there's a candidate who's advocating this paternalism, and there's actually a candidate who now says, you know what, there's a groundswell of support for government getting off people's backs. And if you elect me, I'm going to dismantle, I'm going to repeal, I'm going to reduce, I'm going to cut back until we're as close as possible to the original Constitution of the United States that was meant to be a protector of a system and a philosophy of freedom. But that day is a bit off, but that is the goal towards which we have to work.
Well, you raised a lot of good points. I mean, your point about central planning is just right on. But I'd add a twist to that. As I've long been arguing, I don't believe the president's in charge. I believe it's a systemic problem that the national security establishment, once the U.S. government was converted to a national security state, the national security establishment became in charge of the government. And we have this ostensible thing, this appearance, this veneer, that the president's in charge. He's going to decide what's going to happen with the war in Ukraine, and he's going to decide what's going to happen with respect to U.S. relationship with Israel and Syria and Iran. No, if I'm right, they're irrelevant. They're the veneer. They're the appearance. It's the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA they're making these calls. And I'm not the only one saying that. Michael Glennon wrote this fantastic book called National Security, National Security and Double Government. And he's a professor of law at Tufts University, former counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, makes a very persuasive case that what we're saying is right. They are in charge once that conversion took place. But let's take it to a deeper level, Richard. What are the chances of achieving a genuinely free society? I mean, you and I have a vision of a free society that's very different from a lot of libertarians. I mean, our genuine principles of liberty entail dismantling welfare state programs and the drug war, not reforming them. But what are the chances of achieving that society? And I would venture to say that a lot of libertarians have said, you guys are just pie in the sky. That's impossible. And so what's the point? We might as well get embroiled with the Republicans or the Democrats and participate with them to improve our serfdom, to improve the system. Calling it freedom. They always call it freedom when they're trying to improve the system, like school vouchers is a good example. That, well, we're fighting for freedom by, fighting for school vouchers, which really you and I know are just another socialist reform vehicle to improve the socialist public school system. You want freedom, you got to get rid of public schools. But if you have no hope for that, Richard, then it seems to me it's logical for people to say, well, there's not a chance of achieving freedom, so let's go ahead and devote our lives to reform. I'm reminded of the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where you see everybody being taken over, mentally. And you get to a point where all your friends have been taken over and you say, I might as well let them take me over and I become part of it. There's no sense of resisting anymore. Well, if you look back to like the Gilded Age, 1880 to 1910, my favorite time in history, Not a perfect libertarian panacea, we know that. But to me, it came as close to the principles of economic liberty that we could ever hope for. No income tax, Social Security, Medicare, IRS, welfare, Pentagon, CIA, NSA, drug wars, immigration controls, foreign aid, Federal Reserve, no paper money. I mean, to me, it was incredible. Inventions were coming into existence every day. People were going from rags to riches. The so-called robber barons, a lot of them started out as poor people becoming multimillionaires. Uh, and Yet within what, 30 years, that system has been abandoned. That the statists start out very slowly, very small minority, tiny minority in the late 1800s, early 1900s, saying, let's move to statism, let's move to socialism, let's move to the welfare state, let's move to the managed regulated economy, ultimately to the national security state, the system that we live under today. Well, if you had looked at 1880 and you think, did they have a chance? The statists have a chance? No way. Americans had brought in this system through the Constitution. They liked it, wasn't perfect, but I mean, it was incredible. The world had never seen a society like that before. If the statists could succeed in having that system with new generations of Americans rejected, abandoned in favor of statism, why can't we do the same? Sure, we're a small minority within the libertarian movement. We were genuinely fighting to dismantle this system. We're making the case for that because once you become one of them, like in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you stop making the case for freedom. Now you're making the case for reform, the case for school vouchers, for example. You're no longer trying to convince people that you got to get the state out of education or healthcare or the economy. But if we can continue standing fast, Richard, I have no doubts that that is just as possible as what the statists accomplished back in the 1930s.
You know, I wrote an article one time. I don't know if you remember it. It was when I was president of the Foundation for Economic Education. It was called What Friends of Freedom Can Learn from the Socialists. And I made an analogy similar to your own. I said, imagine that you could go back in a time machine to 1883, and it's in London, and someone is being buried in a cemetery. And this person has maybe a half a dozen people as part of the funeral service, and half of that dozen people are his family members or close friends. You would say this is an inconsequential person. You know, he's going to leave no mark in the world. Yet the fact is, the ideas of that person within 30 years started transforming the world into a terribly dangerous and destructive and deadly direction. Who was that man that died and was being buried with barely a dozen people around him at the funeral site? Karl Marx. Now, I said, imagine that you were a young socialist as you're saying adieu to Marx being lowered into the grave. Look at the world around you. People believe in natural rights. They believe in limited government. They are suspicious of any encroachment on their personal and economic liberty. You're living in basically, historically, what was closer to a laissez-faire free market world than had ever existed before. As that young socialist who is a true believer in these collectivist ideas, you'd have to say it's hopeless. It's a lost cause. How can we ever achieve this? But what the socialists did is that while they may have preached collectivism, they practiced a form of individualism. They intuitively understood that if the ideas of socialism were to triumph, then other human minds had to be persuaded, one mind at a time. Those who held fast to those socialist ideas in the face of a laissez-faire classical liberal world in places like England and the United States, what they did, they rededicated themselves. They had a vision of the world they wanted. They didn't give in to more morose or disappointment or depression or despondency. They redoubled their efforts, and they did so by writing, speaking, conversing, arguing. And that's long before the internet. This is either literally talking or writing things in a pamphlet or a book or a newspaper editorial. But one mind at a time, one mind at a time, one mind at a time. until they had enough people persuaded by their ideal, their ideological goal, that they began to influence policy. And finally, through all of the collectivism of the 20th century, changing the entire direction of modern society in what you and I consider a worse direction. Well, we're now in a world which is dominated by these various collectivist and political paternalistic ideas, these variations on the planning theme. It may be more extreme, more moderate, focused on this, focused on that, but it's that same mindset. And it looks like, how can we ever win? The more the state moves us in this collectivist direction, the more the contradictions, the inconsistencies, the failed outcomes, the corruptions that emerge, the worse the conditions are in terms of personal and social and economic life will cumulatively become. And as a result, more people in their mind will start saying, is this the way we have to live? Is this the best system? And they may not even be conscious about it. But when you or I or someone else who thinks like us gets in a conversation with them, this has not worked. Think about the premise and the presumption about what they presume about you. You're too stupid. You're too ignorant. You're too untrustworthy to just manage and control your own life. Is that what you want to be? A puppet? Another person's strings where they determine your destiny and your future and all of your life opportunities? And one person at a time, one mind at a time, it's possible to turn events around. Just wait, mercantilism was replaced by the classical liberal free trade ideal. And then in another unfortunate twist of fate, the classical liberal ideal began to be superseded by this socialist and collectivist ideal. But now they've had their play, they've had their run, now for well over 100 years. And the contradictions, inconsistencies, and failures are there for anyone to see if they just choose to open their eyes or can have someone just point it out to them in a persuasive and articulate and reasonable manner. And that's our job, to turn this around the way the past has been turned around by minds and individuals, sometimes in right directions, sometimes, unfortunately, in wrong directions. But it's possible for us to do that. And that's our task, even in the face of being sucked into thinking about this transitory election, the outcome of which will be determined tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point that if you look at the system, for example, that existed 1880 to 1910, compared to the system today, we really had in this country two different systems. I mean, both in terms of foreign policy, that was John Quincy Adams' famous 4th of July address, where America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We got Thomas Jefferson, who you mentioned earlier, that said no entangling alliances. And then you had a system where people were free to engage in economic enterprise without control or regulation, minimum wage laws, SEC, and so forth. No IRS, no income tax, no having to file tax returns. You made it, you kept it, and voluntary charity. And this goes along with what I think you were saying too, is that they've destroyed people's faith in themselves and their faith in freedom with this system. We've all been born and raised under it now, and they've convinced people you are an evil people. You cannot be trusted to honor your mother and father on a voluntary basis. You have to have Social Security, the coercive apparatus of the state doing this, forcing you to care for others because you won't do it on yourself because you're so evil. And people buy into this and say, yes, I am evil. I am evil. I need the state to have this system. Because where does the state get its money to fund Social Security? From the younger people through taxation. Why not leave those younger people free to just keep their own money and decide for themselves what to do with it? Because of that mindset that you are an evil person and you need to be forced to do good. There is that lack of faith in free markets, the ability of free markets to regulate themselves, to manage themselves, which are really just people managing their own economic activity. Foreign policy. Why do you need a government serving as a policeman of the world? If you want to go help somebody in another country on an individual private basis, by golly, go and do it. But don't get the government involved. And so what I'm saying, Richard, is that in order to achieve this free society, we not only have to paint that picture of what freedom is so that people can see, hey, there is an alternative here. We don't have to accept the status quo. We don't have to accept this system, even though we were all born and raised in it. But the other thing is that people have to start believing in themselves and in freedom and the principles of voluntary charity to get this nation back on that right road.
It would happen before, and it can happen again. Hayek, as you mentioned, wrote that book, The Road to Serfdom. There once was real serfdom coming out of the medieval period up until the present time. And the government planned, regulated, controlled, restricted, condemned, imprisoned, fined. It was known as mercantilism, the planned economy of the 18th century. And guess what? Ideas mattered. Adam Smith, David Hume, the classical economists of the early and mid 19th century, they transformed everything where people said the government should not do this. The government doesn't have the wisdom and knowledge to do this. The outcomes will be better if individuals are left alone, not just for the personal liberty to direct themselves, but that invisible hand of men interacting in the marketplace, serving others in the process of serving themselves. Self-interest placed upon a proper understanding of the meaning of the common good. If those ideas once had power, and they can have again, particularly as the world moves further in the opposite direction, and people constantly feel the constraint, the disappointments, the frustrations of what the government is doing to them and for them, the outcomes of which become more disappointing, more irritating, and more costly in terms of a sense of personal betterment.
On that excellent note, we'll wrap it up. Richard, I look forward to talking to you post-election, and which of course will be next week. I look forward to it. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next week after the election.
Until next time.